Happy Halloween! This video coming out today is a complete coincidence. I am nowhere near good enough at planning out things to make the blood video come out on Halloween intentionally. You might think I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel with this one, but that's not quite the case. There's actually a fairly interesting discussion that can be had about the implementation of characters bleeding throughout the various games in the Xeno series, and the effects that either showing or not showing blood in a certain scene has on the effectiveness of that scene. Unfortunately, this does legitimately require spoilers for the ending of Xenosaga 3, so effectively 1 and 2 as well, basically the ending of Xenoblade 1, basically the ending of Xenoblade 2, and Chapter 5 of Xenoblade X. So, believe it or not, you can't watch the blood video without getting most of the games in the series spoiled for you, so look out for that. The first thing I want to say is that every single Xeno game so far has been rated T, so obviously you can't go full on with the blood and gore in a game like that and not get an M rating anyway, but I also don't think you need to be super bloody or gory all the time to convey the proper amount of disturbingness or violence or whatever you're trying to get across in a scene. If everyone's gushing blood every time they get hit like it's a No More Heroes game, and then someone takes a bigger hit and starts bleeding again, that's not nearly as much of a big deal as if fights have been largely bloodless the entire time, but when someone takes a big hit, you finally see blood. In this kind of game especially, I think blood is best used sparingly, so this is not a criticism of the lack of blood in Xeno games, it's more a commentary on how it's been used in the past, how some localization changes royally screwed up scenes by removing it, and some instances where I do think it would have been better served to add some into a certain scene. Starting out with Xenogears, we have the flip side of literally all of that, because this game is definitely dark and violent enough where it probably would be rated M if it had come out today, and I'm fairly surprised it got a T rating even back when it first released over 20 years ago. I don't really have any other comments regarding that. Perhaps one of the reasons they haven't done a Xenogears port to modern platforms like they did for all 3 PS1 Final Fantasies is because they wouldn't be able to secure the T rating again without censoring it, and I know more people, including myself, would probably dislike that. So, I don't know. I kind of doubt it. I think Square just likes owning the IP so they can use it to milk nostalgia out of people just by making a bunch of expensive merch but not making the game accessible again. But I might be cynical. I don't think I'm being cynical. But that's just another possibility for why we haven't gotten a port. Moving on to Saga though, believe it or not, we actually have to go through 2 games of censoring a scene to remove blood, making it more effective at being intimidating, before we get to one that was completely ruined by taking it out. Both of the first 2 pieces of censorship have to do with our old friend Albedo, which isn't too big of a surprise given the fact that he's definitely the most unhinged villain in early Saga. The first instance is the infamous Ma Belle Pêche scene from episode 1, where Albedo extracts the Y data from Momo. In addition to the violence, they also toned down the sexuality of this scene in the Western version by, instead of having Albedo's hand go intangible and reach inside Momo's chest, it simply glows and hovers over her forehead, and it also just makes him touch her a bit less in general. I don't know why they bothered on this sense, because it is still incredibly creepy. It is also still an adult man and a 12-year-old looking girl, so I don't really know why they bothered in this case. But as far as the violence goes, they definitely made Albedo seem a lot more imposing. In the Japanese version of this scene, Albedo threatens Momo with a knife, then cuts his own arm, and then cuts his own head off. A bunch of blood starts spurting out of the stump of his neck, but the entire upper part of his body and the head falling on the floor is completely blacked out in order to avoid a higher age rating in Japan. He then steps on his own disembodied head, making a squish sound, and he has regenerative power so it grows back. This is a lot more bloody than the Western version, but it's also a bit less intimidating because he needs a knife to cut his own head off to do any of this. In the Western version, he doesn't threaten Momo with a knife at all, and instead of cutting himself, he rips his own head off, bloodlessly though, but it's also not censored when the head falls on the ground and continues talking. The only actual censorship to that part is removing the sound effect when he crushes his own skull. Personally, and I know a lot of other Xenosaga fans agree with me, think that the ripping his own head off is a bit more in character and a lot more intimidating, plus the fact that you can still see his head when it's disembodied on the ground and talking makes this scene a lot more effective in the quote-unquote censored version, and any amount of blood being or not being there doesn't really change that. The other big Albedo change comes in the flashback portion of episode 2, where we see Albedo testing out his regenerative abilities by blowing his own head off. In the Japanese version, he used a gun and just shot himself, while in the Western version, he uses his powers to generate a ball of energy and seemingly vaporizes his head. Again, your mileage may vary, but I personally think the Western version is more effective because it shows off his power a lot more. He's shown here in a much physically younger and presumably weaker state than when we actually have to fight him as an enemy in-game, and he's already capable of not only disintegrating someone's head with one use of his power, but also completely regenerating his own head, which we've already seen him do later on in episode 1. To me, that seems like a much greater show of power than can regenerate singular bullet wound, albeit one in the head. As far as bad changes go, how about removing all of the blood from Xenosaga Episode 3? This is the most egregious because these are also the scenes where the blood being there is the most effective. The biggest scene of this comes at the very end of the first disc of the game, where we see another flashback and get to witness the event that traumatized Shion so much in the first place, as well as leading to the Milshin conflict, and that is the death of her parents, where she sees that they were destroyed by some combat aliens and wants them to get fixed somehow, trying to pick up their blood and put it back in their bodies, asking why it won't go back. The problem with this is, there is no blood in the English version, so she is just cupping air in her hands and trying to put air back in their body while trying to say, why can't I put it back? Why can't I put it back? It doesn't work at all, and the scene kind of makes no sense unless you already have the context of there is supposed to be a bunch of blood there. The other scene that's significantly hurt by this is the end of the second disc and the end of the game as a whole, where Jin and Cosmos are making their last stand against a bunch of Gnosis while Chaos is trying to do his thing and make the Zohar go away. Cosmos obviously doesn't bleed at all, but Jin does a bit in the Japanese version, and all of that is removed in the Western one. I believe Alan is also shown to have a couple wounds in that scene in Japanese as well, and that's also removed, but that's less significant because this is Jin making his last stand and sacrificing himself, and he gets impaled twice and doesn't bleed at all from either of them, which is kind of silly if you really think about it. This is also going into the whole thing I said before, where if you use your blood sparingly and put it in important scenes, it's a lot more effective. And I think the fact that Jin is fighting alongside Cosmos, who's a significantly more powerful character than him, and still holding his own against the same Gnosis that's eventually going to take most of her limbs off too, I feel like him putting up this heroic last stand and getting destroyed, but still standing up again after getting impaled and killing a Gnosis with its own weapon should warrant at least a little blood spurt the second time he gets impaled when he draws with this giant creature, finally passing away from his wounds. They could have at least toned down the blood. I don't know if that really matters as a whole, but in reality, he coughs it up once when he gets stabbed the first time, it spurts out a bit when he gets stabbed the second time, and he has a little trickling out of his mouth when he actually passes away. I don't know if they needed to remove that in the first place, and I think the lack of that makes the scene of his heroic sacrifice diminish significantly. Jumping into the Blade series, Xenoblade 1 uses it extremely sparingly, but almost perfectly. We only see people bleed in very few select occurrences, but when it happens, it is really impactful. I'm only referring to blood from actual wounds here, but it is also worth mentioning that the red lines on faced Mechon may also be indicative of the Hom's blood in them, so there's probably a lot more blood in the game than you actually realize. The three big and super impactful instances of characters bleeding are Dunban coughing up some blood, which is made darker in Definitive Edition to suggest that it could be also like bodily fluids in addition to blood, when he becomes incapable of using a Nado, and the two big times when Metalface stabs someone with his big claws right in front of someone else, so Fiora and then Saurian Antiqua. This is all well and good, but there is one instance of an important character surprisingly and devastatingly getting wounded, and they don't bleed at all, despite the blocking of the scene heavily suggesting that they should be. And that is Shulk in Mechonis Core when he gets shot by Dixon, not bleeding at all, despite the fact that after he gets shot, he looks down at his hand, suggesting that either the bullet went through him and fell in his hand, the bullet went through him and he's bleeding on his hand, or the bullet didn't go through him and there's still blood on his hand anyway. And yet, there's no blood there whatsoever. This is stupid for several reasons. The first reason is, of course, he got completely shot through the body, he should be bleeding, if getting impaled by claws is enough to make someone bleed in this game. The second is, in some of the storyboards that were released in the Minato Secret Files art book, we can see the storyboard for this scene, and we can see that Shulk has blood on his hand there. And the third thing is, in Definitive Edition, they didn't add blood to this scene, despite the fact that new facial expressions were added because of the new improved character models, so they did have to go back and reanimate things in every single cutscene of the game, including this one, and they still didn't make this change to something that was in the storyboards already. This is legitimately one of my biggest minor complaints about Definitive Edition, despite it only being something you'd realize if you look at the scene a couple of times, but I genuinely think that not including blood in that one specific instance is a significant detriment to that scene and the effectiveness of seeing, oh god, the protagonist just got shot. While Xenoblade X censored a few things in addition to having a somewhat questionable English script in a few places, and one of those censorship changes was absolutely justified, one thing they did not touch whatsoever was the blood in the game, and this is for a very good reason. If you look at the ESRB ratings for Xenoblades 1 and X, you'll see that 1 has blood and X only has animated blood. And this is because there is no red blood anywhere in X, and it seems like red or realistic to human type blood is considered worthy for a different classification or a higher age rating in some cases under the ESRB. Keep in mind, it's like this in Japanese too, and I'm fairly certain there's a similar blood color thing in their rating system, which basically allows them to get away with a whole lot more, because X is by far the bloodiest game in the Xenoblade series, which kind of comes with the territory with your enemies having destructible parts, because on a lot of organic enemies, those spurt in a lot of different colors except red whenever you destroy one. It isn't super pronounced in cutscenes, but in gameplay you can also see that some of the sentient humanoid enemies do bleed when you attack them, and again, they're not human, they can bleed in different colors, it doesn't count if it's a sentient creature bleeding if it's not red for some reason. I know I said non-human before, but this actually carries over to human as well, because you're not a flesh and blood human, you're a robot, and so is every other human character in X. So hey, you can bleed too, because you don't have to bleed red because you're not a flesh and blood human. This is probably the only way they were able to get away with your character literally getting their arm blown off at the end of a story mission and having to go into a test tube and recover and get one built. If you look back at that scene, the shoulder joint is not just sparking, there is a ton of blue fluid coming out of there, and like, if that was just colored red, and the wires and stuff were changed into like flesh and sinew and bone and stuff, that would easily be something from an M-rated game, but it's not, because you're a robot. And now I know that mimeosomes are specifically supposed to be things to mimic the actual human body as much as possible, so I guess if they really wanted to, they could have just dyed the blood red unless it needed to be a specific exact kind of solution to work. But if you paid attention to the Japanese version, this would make a whole lot more sense, because X made a lot of pointless localization changes, and them changing the name of the Holy Grail to the Aegis in Xenoblade 2, then having Malos name himself after an actual Holy Grail in Torna, was not the first time a pointless name change bit the localizers on the ass in this series. The Japanese name for mimeosomes is blue blood, so them having blue blood shouldn't be a surprise, even though that would make zero sense with the name mimeosome, which suggests perfect mimicking of humanity. Speaking of localization changes that are going to completely screw over the localization in the future, Blade was changed from Beyond the Logos Artificial Destiny Emancipator to Builders of the Legacy After the Destruction of Earth, and there are several issues with that. The first thing is, artificial being in the acronym is a very early hint that the humans are artificial, that is just not present in the English or other localized versions. Then, Destiny Emancipator is a thematic callback to the entire point of Xenoblade Chronicles 1, which is again, not present in the localized versions. And then, there's also Logos in there. I am of the opinion that Malos, or at the very least the Logos powers of the Trinity Processor Core, are not at all dead or gone. So I can't wait to see the localizers have to try and spin the Blade acronym being connected to Malos the whole time, when it turns out, oh, go figure, the only two things named Logos in the series are actually connected to each other in some secret plot twist in the next game. So yeah, that's gonna be fun when it inevitably happens. Moving on to Xenoblade 2, this is basically Bloodless the game, because this doesn't even have blood listed anywhere on its ESRB rating, and the T comes from a bunch of other things, with violence still being included, because obviously there's still a ton of intense fighting, even though people don't bleed at all, and it kind of looks really bad that they don't. That's not to say the game doesn't have blood or visible wounds on characters at all, but they're so understated you have to actually look out for it to notice that it's there in the first place. While in X, the different colored blood is justified because nothing is human or humanoid, and even the humans have different colored stuff, in 2, it's a lot less so, because not only are more of the sentient races humanoid, and most blades look like humans in general, but also they do a really bad job of conveying that certain things are supposed to be blood in the first place. 2 instances of this really poor conveyance are in the aptitude scene, where that one Gormati guy fails to awaken a blade and either dies or gets severely injured. I'm still not certain on what actually happens to him, because it looks like he's only severely injured, but I think some NPCs imply he died later on, so yeah. This is the scene where Rex literally goes, "Oh, so much blood," after seeing him fail, but when he fails to awaken the core, we only see an explosion and then he's unconscious. That explosion spurts out some whitish blue stuff, which is apparently supposed to be Gormati blood, which doesn't really track because I'm pretty sure it's implied that everyone bleeds red in this universe. And you can't even tell that it's not light because it doesn't look liquid or anything other than light whatsoever, so that's already bad conveyance. Then there's the end of Chapter 6, where Jin stabs Zeke and he's like, "Haha, you're so cool because you didn't die instantly from my nothing personnel attack, yeah." And Zeke is actually bleeding after this, because you can see a darkened spot on his outfit where, oh yeah, that's blood because he just got stabbed in like the liver or whatever, but you have to slow down the scene and look directly at Zeke to even notice this, because it's also dark and not light, so it already blends in with his gray cape coat thing, so it's borderline impossible to tell that he's even bloodied in the first place, at which point you're just doing extra work for something no one's going to notice because you didn't make it obvious. And then there's also Rex getting stabbed by Jin in Chapter 1, which is the biggest instance of, I'm not even sure if there's supposed to be blood in this scene or not, because I genuinely can't tell. Obviously, Rex gets stabbed through the heart. In reality, he would be bleeding. That just makes sense. This is a video game that's trying to go for a T rating, so they're not going to show his heart getting stuck outside of his body on Jin's sword or whatever, or him bleeding profusely, or directly showing the gaping wound. That's obviously well out of the purview of this and completely unnecessary, but Jin's sword is not shown to be bloody, although we do see him do a little flourish, which would usually be used to shake blood off of the sword once he pulls it out of him. And then when Rex is face planted, we see a bunch of red things around him, which I can't tell if those are splotches of blood, or if those are fragments of Pyra's sword, because Jin also shattered Pyra's sword, and they're brighter than the sword, but they also don't look liquid, so I can't tell if it's supposed to be blood that just doesn't look like blood, or if it's fragments of sword that are lit weird so they look blood-colored. I genuinely can't tell, but I also think it's really stupid that we didn't see any of Rex's blood on Jin's sword, because again, this is the sequel to the game that had a daughter watch her father get impaled through the body by a giant robot's claws, and the blood almost drip off onto her. I think they could also show it here. I don't know. I'm probably being a stickler, but it's really stupid. In other scenes, the one time where blood is completely shown is when it's shown for comedy with Tora and his family's nosebleeds. So, I don't know, there's not really anything else to say there. I guess because a nosebleed isn't violent, and it's also confirmed in-game that you can't die from a nosebleed. So it's not like, oh, they're in danger because they're bleeding so much, and it's also a purely comedy scene. I guess they could get away with that more. A real instance of wounds actually directly being shown is when Rex and Pyra are comparing, and that's when they can first really tell that they share pain completely, but that's also a little bit after a fight when they're still, like, cleaning up and stuff. So it makes sense for them to, like, not be directly bleeding out of those wounds. They're dried up and ready to be bandaged properly, so I think that makes perfect sense there. It's just, again, the wound color isn't contrasting enough with their skin color to make it not look like a fan service scene staring at Pyra's thighs, because she's supposed to have one cut there, and apparently some people don't notice that. Now, since Rex is still a toss-up because I genuinely am not sure what's going on in that scene, is the one instance where someone definitely should be bleeding but also definitely isn't, and that is Van Damme's heroic sacrifice in Chapter 3. Like, if you're gonna show a character getting stabbed by the bad guy and not have a drop of blood, whatever, but if you really want to sell the impact of this guy is using his last-ditch power that involves stabbing himself, I feel like you're gonna want to show at least a little bit of blood in that scene, but they don't. You could reasonably make the argument that, oh, he's got ether flowing through him, that's hot or whatever, and that's cauterizing the wounds, or maybe Orion biology is more different than humans than we think, and they might not even have blood at all, but that's also not conveyed well whatsoever, and apparently Gormati do have blood, so Orion's having them is not something that should come as a surprise either, and it would be more of a surprise if they don't. So yeah, I'm not really sure what they were doing here. Maybe the fact that he doesn't bleed at all is just like, that just shows how strong his conviction is, because like, I feel like if they had, alright, this is my last act, stabs himself, starts coughing up blood, that might be like, I don't know if this is an offensive or Australian accent, but like, that might make him look a little weak in the face of this, but like, the actual stab points themselves should probably be bleeding a little bit. Maybe they are, and I just can't see it, but I don't really think so, and I think that's another missed opportunity. Now, he does get cut down by Malos later on, and that doesn't show any blood, but that's also shown from the back. Van Damme has a very large body that was obscuring the screen, and I don't think the wound itself would cover from the entire left to the entire right, so it makes sense that you wouldn't see there anyway. And again, this is the instance of him using the pointy bits on the handles of his scythes to stab himself to get power to save the rest of the main cast. So I think the more impactful point of this entire sequence would be him stabbing himself and not him getting cut by Malos. So if you're going to have blood in one moment in that scene, it should be that part. But yeah, that's the Xenoblood video. Maybe they'll go with the bloodless route in Xenoblade 3. Maybe they'll go back to something like 1. Maybe they'll do something like X to be violent while still being T. I'm not sure. But again, I need to point out that just adding more blood to every single scene in the game is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about instances where a small amount could be used once or twice more in a game in a way that would cause more effect. And again, this isn't like a 2D anime or something like that. This is a 3D game where every unique wound needs to be saved as a different asset that takes up memory time and processing power. So you also just don't want to have your characters get visibly wounded in every cutscene anyway, because that would take too long and take too much pointless work and pointless asset use on something that has diminishing returns after a while. So yeah, have your characters show wounds in certain circumstances, but also only choose the few circumstances per game when it has the most impact. But yeah, that's all I've got to say on this. Until next time, happy Halloween. This is Luxon signing off. I am terrible at these outros for unscripted videos, and in fact I'm so bad that in my first take of this line I said scripted. So goodbye.